Laura Matthews sat in her empty kitchen, staring at the sealed envelope that had haunted her for 3 months. The morning light filtered through dusty blinds, casting shadows across the unopened letter bearing her mother's unmistakable handwriting. At 52, she had mastered the art of living with resentment, carrying it like a heavy coat she couldn't remove. The funeral had been a blur of polite condolences and shared memories that felt foreign to her ears. People spoke of Margaret Matthews as a loving mother, a devoted woman who cherished her family. Laura had nodded appropriately, played the grieving daughter, while inside she felt nothing but the familiar ache of years-old anger that had calcified into indifference. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. That's how long it had been since they last spoke, since the argument that shattered whatever fragile connection remained between them. Laura could still taste the bitterness of those final words, the accusations hurled like weapons, the door slammed with such force it seemed to echo through time itself. The lawyer had handed her the letter with gentle eyes, explaining that her mother had left specific instructions. "To be given to Laura after my passing," he had said, his voice heavy with the weight of unfinished business. She had tucked it away, telling herself she would read it when she was ready, knowing deep down that day might never come. But today felt vivid somehow, as if the very air around her was charged with possibility. The letter seemed to pulse with untold secrets, and Laura found herself wondering if some truths were worth the pain of discovery. She reached for the envelope with trembling fingers, then pulled back, caught between curiosity and the safety of not knowing. The memory came flooding back without invitation, as vivid as if it were happening again. 3 years ago, in this very kitchen, voices raised in a crescendo of hurt and misunderstanding. Margaret had been trying to help, as she always did, but her words came out wrong, twisted by years of miscommunication and unspoken expectations. "You never listened to me, Mom," Laura had screamed, her face flushed with frustration. "You think you know what's best for everyone, but you don't know anything about my life." The accusation had hung between them like a physical barrier, dividing mother from daughter with surgical precision. Margaret's face had crumpled, her usual composure finally breaking under the weight of Laura's anger. The fight had been about David, Laura's ex-husband, and his latest request for money. Margaret had suggested that perhaps Laura was being too generous, too willing to enable his irresponsible behavior. But Laura heard criticism where her mother intended concern, judgment where there should have been support. The conversation had spiraled into something much deeper and more painful. "I raised you better than this," Margaret had whispered, the words barely audible but cutting deeper than any shout. Laura had felt something snap inside her chest, a final thread of connection severing with an almost audible break. She had grabbed her purse and headed for the door, pausing only to deliver her own devastating blow. The door had closed behind her with finality, and neither of them had been brave enough to cross that threshold again. Now, staring at the letter, Laura wondered if her mother had been trying to bridge that gap from beyond the grave. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Laura finally broke the seal. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind her mother had always saved for special occasions. The date at the top stopped her breath. It had been written just 2 weeks after their fight, when the wound was still fresh and bleeding. "My dearest Laura," the letter began, and already tears were blurring her vision. It had been so long since her mother had called her that, since any endearment had passed between them. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if each word had been weighed and measured before being committed to paper. "I have started this letter 100 times, crumpled it up, begun again. How do you apologize for a loving someone wrong? How do you explain that every harsh word came from a place of desperate fear, not indifference? Laura's throat constricted as she read, her mother's voice echoing in her mind with startling clarity. The letter continued with painful honesty. I know you think I never understood you, that I criticized your choices because I thought less of you. The truth is far more shameful than that, my darling girl. I criticized because I saw so much of myself in you, and I was terrified you would make the same mistakes that cost me so dearly. Laura set the letter down, her heart pounding. This wasn't the cold, judgmental woman she had built up in her memory. This was someone raw and vulnerable, someone who sounded remarkably like herself in her darkest, most honest moments. She realized she had never considered that her mother might have been afraid too. The letter revealed a woman Laura had never known existed beneath the surface of her seemingly confident mother. Margaret wrote about her own failed first marriage, a secret Laura had never suspected. She described the shame of returning home pregnant and alone at 22, facing her parents' disappointment and society's judgment with a spine made of steel and a heart full of terror. I swore I would never let you feel that kind of helplessness, Margaret had written. But in trying to make you stronger, I made you feel small. In trying to protect you from my mistakes, I pushed you toward different ones. The very love I felt for you became the weapon I used to wound you, and I have never forgiven myself for that. Laura read about sleepless nights when she was a child, when Margaret would stand in her doorway watching her sleep, praying for the wisdom to be the mother her daughter deserved. She learned about sacrifices made in silence, opportunities declined, dreams deferred, all in service of providing stability for her family. The most devastating revelation came in the middle pages. When you married David, I bit my tongue 1,000 times. I saw the signs that you refused to see, watched him diminish your light bit by bit. But I remembered my own mother's disapproval of my choices, how it drove me further into the wrong arms, and I stayed silent when I should have spoken, spoke when I should have listened. Every line was an excavation of buried truth, unearthing a landscape of love that Laura had never imagined existed. Her mother hadn't been indifferent to her struggles. She had been drowning in them, trying to navigate the impossible waters between protection and freedom, between guidance and control. Margaret's words painted a picture of motherhood as a series of impossible choices, each decision carrying the weight of potential regret. She wrote about the delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between offering wisdom and allowing discovery. Laura began to understand that what she had interpreted as criticism might have been her mother's clumsy attempts at connection. I watched you struggle with David's addiction, saw you pour your savings into his promises of recovery, and my heart broke for you. When I suggested you step back, I wasn't judging your compassion. I was admiring it while fearing for your future. I had loved someone who couldn't love himself once, and I recognized the exhaustion in your eyes. The letter described Margaret's own journey through counseling, her attempts to understand where she had gone wrong in their relationship. She had spoken to therapists about the generational patterns of communication, the ways that trauma and love could become tangled together like vines around a tree, each feeding off the other in destructive symbiosis. I learned that I had been parenting you the way I wished I had been parented, instead of the way you needed to be loved. I gave you structure when you needed freedom, advice when you needed listening, solutions when you needed empathy. By the time I understood this, the distance between us felt impossible to bridge. Laura found herself remembering moments differently now, seeing them through this new lens of understanding. Her mother's rigid schedules hadn't been about control, but about creating the stability she had never known. The endless questions about her life hadn't been invasive, but desperate attempts to maintain connection across a growing chasm of misunderstanding. The middle section of the letter revealed the architecture of Margaret's sacrifices, the careful construction of a life designed around her daughter's needs. Laura learned about job opportunities declined because they would have required relocation, about relationships ended because they have complicated Laura's sense of security, about dreams quietly shelved to make room for more practical concerns. "You were 14 when Robert asked me to marry him," Margaret wrote, referring to a man Laura barely remembered from her adolescence. "He was kind, stable, everything I thought I wanted. But you were struggling in school, dealing with the bullying that you never told me about but I could see in your withdrawn silences. I chose you over him, and I have never regretted that choice." Laura's hands trembled as she read about her mother's awareness of struggles she thought she had hidden successfully. The bullying at school, the eating disorder she had battled in secret, the depression that had settled over her like fog during her junior year of high school. Margaret had seen it all, had rearranged her entire life around providing subtle support without acknowledging the problems directly. "I thought if I didn't name your pain, it wouldn't become real," the letter continued. "I thought if I just loved you consistently enough, the darkness would eventually give way to light. I didn't understand that sometimes acknowledgement is the first step toward healing, that witnessing someone's pain can be more powerful than trying to fix it." The revelation that her mother had been watching, caring, sacrificing in silence all those years created a seismic shift in Laura's understanding of their relationship. She had felt invisible, unsupported, misunderstood, while her mother had been orchestrating her entire existence around Laura's unspoken needs. Margaret's letter took a more urgent tone as it progressed, as if she could sense time running short even as she wrote it. "I need you to understand that our last fight wasn't about David or money or your choices. It was about my terror that I was losing you completely, that all my years of loving you had somehow added up to nothing but distance and misunderstanding." She described the weeks following their argument, the numerous times she had picked up the phone only to set it down again, paralyzed by pride and fear in equal measure. "I told myself you needed space, that calling would only make things worse. But the truth is, I was afraid you would tell me never to call again, and I wasn't strong enough to survive that finality." The letter revealed Margaret's declining health, something she had hidden from everyone. "The doctors found the cancer 6 months ago," she wrote. "I could have told you, could have used it as a bridge to your heart. But I didn't want your love to come from obligation or pity. I wanted to earn your forgiveness, not demand it through circumstance." Laura's vision blurred as she read about her mother's solitary journey through diagnosis and treatment, the way she had faced her mortality alone rather than risk manipulating her daughter's emotions. It was perhaps the most selfless act in a lifetime of selfless acts, and Laura felt the first crack in the wall of resentment she had built around her heart. "I am writing this because I need you to know that every harsh word I ever spoke to you came from love turned inside out by fear. I was so afraid of losing you to bad choices that I nearly lost you to my own. I was so determined to make you strong that I forgot to show you how cherished you were." The letter's tone shifted toward reflection and hope as Margaret wrote about the lessons she had learned too late to implement. "I spent so many years trying to prepare you for a world I thought would hurt you that I forgot to celebrate the woman you were becoming. I focused so intently on your mistakes that I failed to acknowledge your triumphs, your resilience, your beautiful heart." Laura read about her mother's pride in her career achievements, her admiration for the way Laura had handled her divorce with dignity, her respect for the woman her daughter had become, despite what Margaret saw as her own parenting failures. "You are everything I hoped you would be, and nothing like I expected, and that is exactly as it should be." The words began to unlock memories Laura had buried, moments when she had caught glimpses of her mother's pride, but dismissed them as too little, too late. She remembered Margaret's face at her college graduation, the way it had glowed with joy that Laura had been too angry to acknowledge. She recalled her mother's quiet support during the divorce, practical help offered without judgment or condition. "I know you think, I never approved of your choices, but the truth is, I was in awe of your courage. You took risks I never dared to take. Loved with an openness I never allowed myself. Pursued dreams I was too frightened to even acknowledge. You were everything I had wanted to be, but never had the strength to become. Each revelation was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place, creating a picture of their relationship that was entirely different from the one Laura had been carrying. Her mother hadn't been her critic, but her secret admirer, watching from the sidelines and cheering silently for victories she had never acknowledged witnessing. In the letter's most vulnerable passages, Margaret wrote about the specific moments that had shaped her as a mother, the experiences that had formed her particular brand of worried love. She described holding Laura as a newborn and feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of shaping another human being, the crushing weight of knowing that every decision would ripple forward into an unknowable future. "I used to watch you sleep and make bargains with God," she wrote. "Let her be happy, I would pray. Let her be safe. Let me be wise enough not to damage this perfect soul with my imperfect love. I think now that perhaps I prayed for the wrong things. I should have prayed for the courage to let you stumble and the wisdom to trust your own strength." The letter revealed Margaret's struggle with her own mother's critical voice, the way generational patterns had echoed through their family like sound bouncing off canyon walls. She wrote about breaking cycles and creating new ones, about the impossible task of giving a child both roots and wings, security and independence, guidance and freedom to make mistakes. "I see now that I spent so much energy trying not to repeat my mother's mistakes that I made entirely new ones. I was so determined not to be cold and distant that I became controlling and anxious. I wanted so desperately to be the mother I needed that I forgot to discover the mother you needed." Laura found herself crying openly now, not just for the pain of their estrangement, but for the tragedy of two people who had loved each other so deeply but had never learned to speak the same language of affection. Her mother's heart had been an ocean of devotion that had somehow been filtered through a vocabulary of worry and correction. The final pages of the letter took on an almost spiritual quality, as if Margaret had found peace in the act of complete honesty. "I am not asking for your forgiveness, my darling girl, because I understand that forgiveness cannot be requested, only offered. I am not even asking for your understanding, though I hope these words might plant seeds that bloom into compassion someday." She wrote about her hopes for Laura's future, her dreams that her daughter would find love again, would trust her own judgment, would remember that she was worthy of joy despite all the ways life might have suggested otherwise. "You have always been enough, exactly as you are. Any suggestion otherwise came from my own fears, not from any deficit in your beautiful soul." Margaret's words painted a picture of unconditional love that had somehow been lost in translation over the years, buried beneath layers of anxiety and miscommunication, but never diminished. "I loved you when you were born, when you took your first steps, when you brought home your first report card, when you walked down the aisle, when you cried in my kitchen over David's latest relapse. I loved you in the grocery store when you were 3 and having a tantrum. I loved you when you were 16 and screaming that you hated me. I loved you when you walked out of this house for the last time." The letter acknowledged that love alone hadn't been enough, that good intentions couldn't bridge the gap created by poor execution. But it also offered something Laura hadn't known she needed, the absolute certainty that she had been cherished every single day of her life, even when it hadn't felt that way. "If I could have one more conversation with you, I would listen more and speak less. I would ask about your dreams instead of voicing my fears. I would celebrate your victories instead of analyzing your choices. I would tell you every day that you were exactly the daughter I had hoped for, that watching you become yourself was the greatest privilege of my life." Laura set the letter down with shaking hands, her entire understanding of her life rewritten in her mother's careful script. The woman who had died 3 months ago was not the woman she had been angry with for 3 years. That woman had been a construction of hurt feelings and misunderstood intentions, a fiction created by two people who had loved each other desperately but had never learned how to show it properly. The silence in the kitchen felt different now, no longer empty, but full of presence, as if her mother's spirit had been waiting for this moment of recognition. Laura could almost feel Margaret beside her, not the critical figure of her memory, but the frightened, loving woman revealed in these pages, someone who had been doing her best with tools that had been inadequate to the task. She thought about all the conversations they would never have, all the opportunities for understanding that had been lost to pride and stubbornness on both sides. But she also realized that this letter was itself a conversation, perhaps the most honest one they had ever shared. Her mother had found a way to reach across the divide between life and death to offer the explanation Laura had needed but had been too angry to ask for. The weight of wasted time pressed against her chest like a physical force. 3 years of silence that could have been filled with healing, with gradual understanding, with the slow work of rebuilding trust. But she realized that regret was just another prison, another way of refusing to receive the gift her mother had tried to give her. Margaret had written this letter not to burden her with guilt, but to free her from the incorrect story she had been telling herself about their relationship. It was an act of love disguised as a final message, a mother's last attempt to ensure her daughter understood her own worth. Over the following days, Laura found herself rereading the letter, each pass revealing new layers of meaning she had missed in her initial shock. Her mother's words began to reframe not just their relationship, but Laura's understanding of herself, her choices, her worth. She began to see her own life through the lens of someone who had been loved unconditionally, even when that love had been expressed imperfectly. She thought about forgiveness, not as something her mother needed from beyond the grave, but as something she could give herself. The anger she had carried had been a burden she had chosen to bear, a weight that had shaped her interactions with everyone else in her life. Releasing it felt like setting down luggage she had been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. The guilt came next, waves of it that threatened to drown her in regret. She had been so certain of her righteous anger, so convinced of her mother's failures, that she had never considered her own role in their estrangement. She had been as stubborn as Margaret, as proud, as unwilling to make the first move toward reconciliation. But as she sat with these feelings, Laura began to understand that this too was part of her mother's final gift. Margaret had modeled forgiveness in the letter itself, showing Laura how to hold both love and disappointment, how to acknowledge hurt while releasing resentment. The letter was a masterclass in grace, written by someone who had learned too late how to offer it. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing, but about choosing to see the whole picture instead of focusing only on the parts that had caused pain. Her mother had been flawed, had made mistakes, had caused real hurt. But she had also been human, trying to love in the only way she knew how, shaped by her own experiences and limitations. On a gray morning 6 weeks after reading the letter, Laura drove to Hillcrest Cemetery with a heart that felt both heavy and light, carrying grief and gratitude in equal measure. She had visited once before for the burial, but had stood at the back of the crowd, feeling disconnected from the ceremony, from the other mourners, from her own emotions. This time she came alone, carrying a small bouquet of daisies, Margaret's favorite flowers, a detail she had forgotten until it surfaced with startling clarity. The headstone was simple, elegant, bearing her mother's name and dates, and the words "beloved mother" that had seemed almost ironic to her at the time of ordering it. She sat in the grass beside the grave and began to speak, her voice quiet but steady. "I read your letter, Mom. I understand. Now, I'm sorry it took me so long to see you clearly, to see myself clearly. I'm sorry we ran out of time to have this conversation while you were still here to hear my part of it. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, years of unspoken thoughts and feelings pouring out like water from a broken dam. She talked about her marriage, her fears, her dreams, all the things she had wanted to share but had been too proud or too hurt to voice. She told her mother about her life now, the small joys and daily struggles that make up the texture of ordinary existence. "I know you're not really here," she said finally, her hand resting on the cool stone. "But I also know that love doesn't end just because someone dies. Your love is still with me, in this letter, in my memories, in all the ways you shaped me that I'm only beginning to understand. I'm going to try to do better, to love better, to forgive faster. That's how I'll honor you." As she prepared to leave, Laura felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The story she had been telling herself about her life, her worth, her mother's love had been rewritten. Not erased, the pain and the mistakes were still real, but expanded to include the whole truth instead of just the parts that had hurt. She walked back to her car with the absolute certainty that some conversations continue long after words cease, that understanding can bloom even in the soil of loss, and that the deepest love often speaks loudest in the quiet spaces after we think we've heard the last word. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true, emotional tales about love, family, and forgiveness. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel. Another heartfelt reminder that sometimes love speaks loudest after we're gone.